Hello, welcome to another edition of That Millwall podcast. Today we have a Who Are You? It's a little bit of a unique and special Who Are You for me today. Firstly, we have a few technical problems, so you won't see either myself or my guest. And it's a special interview for me because I'm actually interviewing my dad. It's Dean Jones, my dad. Dad, how are you?
I'm all right, Stephen. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Very well. And it's quite strange because when I've done a few of these, obviously, I don't know the answers that are coming most of the time with most of the interviews that I do. But I get the feeling that I'm going to know pretty much every answer that you give in this interview. But obviously, this is for the benefit of our viewers and our listeners at home. Dad, can I just start with? We'll go straight into it. Yep. How did you become a Millwall supporter?
Well, it's like most people, Stephen. It's because my dad did, really. When I started really very young. When I was 4 years old, Dad used to go to Millwall with a group of friends, and we used to stand at the Alderton Road end of the ground, right in the corner. And it really started from there. Dad did have trials when he was a younger man at Millwall, but unfortunately, it came to nothing. But Millwall was a very important part of my dad's life because he would work hard during the week and then spend his money on watching Millwall with his chums, and then latterly with me, he took me, and it would become a regular thing. So that's really how I started, through my dad, really.
And you touched on there that where your dad used to stand and where he used to bring you. Memories of the old ground, and where was your favourite spot?
Well, the Den was a very unique place. I've listened to the other Who Are Yous, and people will always say it was a very unique place. It was a very intimidating. No one liked coming to the Den, and no matter where you stood, you got that feeling that we were invincible. And I think that's helped Millwall over the years. So wherever we stood, we would stand. I started off at the Alderton Road end of the ground, and then latterly, when my dad didn't go so much, I sort of made my own way, and I found myself on the halfway line. And the halfway line, particularly with the glory days and the big crowds, was a really, really good place to stand. You'd get a good view, and the atmosphere was quite electric on the big days.
And do you remember? And for the benefit of the viewers at home, I'm sure you won't mind me saying this, it was a long time ago, your first game as a Millwall fan. Do you remember it? Do you have any memories? What was your first impressions?
I have no memories of the game, but my very first game was in the 1964-65 season. It was an early season game against Brighton at the Den, and I was barely 4 years old. And I remember at the time that I was in the early days, I would stand on an old orange box that in those days you were allowed to bring in, so the kids could look over the tops of the heads of the other spectators. That was my first game in 1965, and as an offshoot to that, it just so happened that year Millwall finished runner-up to Brighton, I think in the old 4th division, and they were promoted into Division 3. So my first game, my first season, saw Millwall very successful.
And you said there that you obviously don't really remember the first game. What's the first game that you remember, maybe parts of the game or the atmosphere? What's the earliest memory you've got of a game?
The earliest memory of a game I have at Millwall was a League Cup tie, and that was in 1969, and we were drawn against Stoke City. We'd drawn at their place, I think, 0-0, and in those days the replay was barely a couple of days later. So I think that might have been on the Saturday, or I'm not quite sure, but the home game was on a Monday evening, and it was quite exciting because not only were they in the first division, but they had Gordon Banks playing for them, England goalkeeper. And so everybody turned up at the game on the Monday night, wanted to see Millwall win a cup tie against a team in a higher league, but also to see Gordon Banks. And the thing was, when the teams were announced prior to the game, he was injured, and his deputy John Farmer was in goal. So that was a bit of a disappointment. But as for the game itself, Millwall ended up winning 2-1. I think with a goal from Derek Posse. It was a header from a corner, and it was quite a successful evening, but disappointing that England's goalkeeper wasn't in goal for the opposition.
Okay, and I mean, obviously, you know, we're coming before we come on to some memories. We'll talk about the current ground. I don't like to refer to it as the new Den, as you know. It's now the Den. We've been there. Yep. This is now 30 years. Obviously, you're the reason why we're here, because without you, I wouldn't be supporting the club. We wouldn't be doing this interview. But my first experience, obviously, you took me to the Den as it is today. What are your thoughts on the ground? Do you like it, and where do you see it?
The new Den isn't the old Den, but then you have to move on. And I think that Millwall still retains a little bit of the fear factor, as the old Den did. It's modern. It brings in revenue streams, and I think people have accepted now that those days of the old Den are gone. As much as you would like them, to remain, and this is the way that Millwall are going. I mean, where we sit, obviously, it's unobstructed views, and they're all unobstructed views. At the old Den, there were places where you just really couldn't see anything, particularly if you was an away supporter, and I think that sort of added to the if you like, the charisma of the ground and the trepidation of the away supporters. But the new Den is a nice ground, and it's home now, and you have to forget about the past. And I think it can be intimidating on certain games.
And where do you sit?
Behind the goal, the Coldblow Lane end with you. And as the viewers probably know, I think you've explained on your Who Are You? We've got a little ritual that we sit right behind the goal, right behind the penalty spot, and in line with the halfway line. But I always forget, as you know, when we go to the games, I always say, Stephen, where am I sitting? Because I never know, quite frankly, where I'm supposed to be sitting. But that's where I sit with you up there.
For the benefit of the viewers and the listeners, the ritual is that my dad has to sit on the left hand side, I have to sit on the right hand side.
That's right.
That's how we're based at the Den. And if we go away from home, we tend to stick to the same thing. Although I do recall the last away game at West Brom, we didn't actually do that. We were the other way around. But more often than not, we do. And at home, we always sit to the left and the right.
We've sat up there for quite a long time now, haven't we? So we get a band of people that we talk to, and it's quite a nice place to sit.
We obviously, we started below in the lower in the south stand, and then moved up to the top. I mentioned obviously on my Who Are You that we sat in the seats that we're in now, and we won the first time we did it. We won the game, and ever since then we had to. Well, I mean, it's not been very successful, but we've had to stay in the same seat. So, well, it has been successful, but if the superstition had been as good as I make it out to be, we probably would have won the Champions League.
Well, we're a long way off that one yet, but I'll see where you're going with that one.
Yeah. I'm gonna test your memory now, or maybe bring back some good memories. Firstly, can I ask your favourite all-time player? And before you ask, I know obviously you've been supporting the club for a long time, so there's been many players that have come and gone. So I'll ask you for your favourite player, but I'll also ask you for perhaps 2 honourable mentions as well.
It's very tough, that one. Is when you've been supporting Millwall for the number of years that I have, and a lot of other people have. You see players come and go, and in different eras, they're the best players. I think it's very close. In the early 70s, Millwall had a player called Keith Weller. He came from Tottenham's reserves along with Derek Posse, and he was by far the best midfielder I've ever seen Millwall have. And in fact, he went on to be sold to Chelsea for £100,000. It was Millwall's first £100,000 transfer, and he went on to play for England as well, and in the European final with Chelsea. But he would be an honourable mention. I think the player that stands out the most over those 50 odd years is, and it might not be to everyone's liking, but I think it's Teddy Sheringham. Teddy Sheringham was a player way before his time. he's indebted to George Graham, the Millwall manager. Teddy was a very young player, and he thought he'd made it before he'd actually made it, and George sort of disciplined him and made him into the player that he was, and ultimately the player that he became. So I think Teddy Sheringham would be my all-time best Millwall footballer.
And a question that I asked one of our other listeners a couple of weeks ago, when that one goes out, it's interesting to see what the answers compare. In your era, it was Teddy Sheringham. In my era, it was Neil Harris. Do you think that Teddy and Bomber would have been able to play as a pair?
I think they would. I think both of them players could play with other players, and particularly other players who were of a talent. I think they would have been a magnificent partnership, and I think they would have scored loads of goals together. Yeah, I do.
And moving on to another question, which again I think it's throughout the time there's been quite a few, but I think there's definitely a couple that will be at the top of this list. Your favourite all-time Millwall manager? Again,
there's been managers that have achieved an awful lot for Millwall, but for what it meant and for what it was, it has to be John Docherty. John Docherty was reserve team manager at Brentford, and Frank McClintock was the manager at Brentford, and Millwall hired both those fellas to come to the Den, and they reversed their roles, and Docherty became manager and Frank McClintock became assistant manager, and between them they managed to get Millwall to a place where they've been trying to get to for many years, and for what it meant to a lot of people, I think that John Docherty basically is the only Millwall manager ever to get Millwall in the top flight, and I think that deserves an awful lot of credit, and I think John Docherty would be the man that I would say is the best Millwall manager of all time.
And obviously, for people that are listening that were around in that era and saw Millwall play in the top division, unfortunately, I wasn't around at that time. Do you think that Gary Rowett, should he achieve the possibly the impossible and get the club into the Premier League this season or perhaps next season, do you think he'd be held in the same regard as John Docherty, as perhaps some of the older supporters?
I think he ought to be, because as I said to you, the golden chalice for any Millwall supporter, anyone connected with Millwall, would be to play in the top league. And I think any manager, given the restraints that are at Millwall and have always been at Millwall, I think it's always more of an achievement than just an achievement to get to the Premier League Division 1, whatever it was at the time. But I think, yes, Gary Rowett, if he managed to get Millwall into the Premier League, whenever he did it, I think Gary Rowett, using the basis of what I use, yes, I believe he'd be a legend. In my eyes, he would be a legend, because not many Millwall managers in 130, 140 years have managed to achieve that particular goal.
That's interesting, because I think there's, at the moment, we have very similar opinions on the club and how things are going at the moment. Not always, but with a majority of the decisions. Yep. And I think Gary Rowett is one that still divides opinions with the fan base. And I think it's interesting that some people would, like yourself, have said, yes, definitely he would be regarded in the same breath. But I do think there'd be a lot of people that perhaps wouldn't.
Well, he's like Marmite, isn't he? You either like him or you don't like him. I mean, to me, it doesn't really matter how you get to where you want to go, as long as you get there. And I don't think any Millwall fan, that supports Millwall would worry if the Gary Rowett way got us to where we wanted to get to. Because at the end of the day, if we won 1-0 every game and we got to the Premier League, I don't think there'd be many people complaining about the way we did it. Do you?
No, I don't. I mean, as you know, I've never been Rowett out, so no. I think he deserves an awful lot of credit for what he's doing at the moment. As you say, there's a lot of things that go on at Millwall that restrict the job that managers maybe have. So I think, I wasn't around for the Docherty era, but personally, for me, I think Gary Rowett would shoot straight to the top of the list of managers should he achieve.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, John Docherty didn't have a lot of money. He spent, in terms of Millwall, I think he spent $250,000. I mean, that was That was in 1989, but we spent a little bit more than we would normally spend. And I think Gary Rowett spent a little bit more than we would normally spend in the last couple of years trying to achieve that. And I think both of them are on a, if you look at it, both of them are on a similar pattern, really. So yeah, Gary Rowett would be well up there in my list of managers.
So taking it away from perhaps best moment or best players and best managers, and going against the grain a little bit, it's quite difficult, this one, because you always want to back any Millwall or any player that wears a Millwall shirt that runs out onto the pitch. You want to back them and you give them your support. But over the years, I would imagine there's been some absolute shockers that you've seen wearing a Millwall shirt. So who would you say is probably the worst player you've ever seen in a Millwall shirt?
Well, I'm going to go with a lot of other people on this one, and I'm going to bring it up to date a little bit. And I think Gary Taylor Fletcher summed up everything that was not right about Ian Holloway and Ian Holloway's tenure at Millwall. It was quite clear that this man was way over the top, way too much weight. He had too much weight, and he was just one of Ian Holloway's chums. And I think for what he did for us, and he didn't do anything, I think Gary Taylor Fletcher's just about at the top of my list for the worst all-time player I've ever seen. Over 50-odd years in a Millwall shirt, to be honest.
What's interesting, I don't think you were at the game, but I went to Brentford, and Harris had taken over by that point, and we drew 2-2. And Gary Taylor Fletcher at Brentford's old ground, as you'll know, you were right on top of the goal. If you were at the top, you were right on top of the goal. And Millwall broke, and the ball fell to Taylor Fletcher in the box, and he pretty much had the whole goal to aim at. And I think, as you said there, and I'm sure the listeners at home would agree, everything that summed him up was an open goal from 4 yards, and he managed to blast it past the post.
Well, I agree, Stephen. Yeah, I agree. I mean, what the question you've got to ask yourself is, what did he actually do for Millwall? What did he win us a game? Did he score? Did he? I mean, I can't remember. I just don't know what he did. I mean, as a striker, he just fouled. He was past it. Yeah, the worst player I've ever seen.
And against the Lions, I mean, we've seen a lot of teams come and go, and sometimes it's quite hard to pick out individual players. But would you say there's anyone that you've seen line up against us and just thought, God, he's terrible?
Do you know, Stephen, I find it hard to answer that question. I've seen so many games, and I really can't think of one, to be honest. I mean, there's been times when you look at players and you think, crikey, like, when Millwall perhaps have won 4 or 5 and the defender's bing terrible or what. But I can't really, off the top of my head, there's been many, and I can't really think of anyone off the top of my head, to be honest.
If I give you a hint of a player, I'll try and give you. And this is obviously your answers, but
was you with me on this one? Was you?
We've seen him a couple of times.
Right.
Perhaps a centre half that may have received a vote or two for Player of the Season.
Oh, did he play for West Ham and Charlton?
Yeah, he did.
I can't think of his name now, but you're going to tell me, aren't you?
Christian Daly.
Yeah, Christian Daly. Yeah, it was something. Christian Daly was a player that just really couldn't play against Millwall, could he? Let's face it. I think it was, again. I think it's the atmosphere, the fact that he was no good, the fact that he was playing Millwall, and yeah, you're quite right. He, I suppose, if I'm going to nick one off you, Christian Daly would be in my top 3, I would think. Yeah, that's a good one, Stephen.
I think it's quite difficult, and obviously, without putting, this is your interview. It's about your story and your thoughts, but it's interesting because apart from the real big match players, I mean, over the years that have come to the Den, you tend to look out for the better players. You don't really look out for the worst players.
That's right.
So, for example, a couple of weeks ago at West Brom, you were looking at Jed Wallace. At QPR, you look for Elias Chair at the moment. Years gone by, you've had like Wes Hoolahan, Adel Taarabt. You know those players, but you never really tend to spot the worst players. You just hope the whole team that we're playing against has a bad game, to be honest with you. So you come away with 3 points.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, this is probably going to be quite tough. So again, I'm going to give you the opportunity for some honourable mentions. I'll give you 2 honourable mentions, and obviously then
right.
your most memorable match involving Millwall.
Most memorable match, it without a doubt would be the FA Cup tie at Highbury in 1995 when Millwall beat Arsenal 2-0. And I think it's Mark Beard and Mark Kennedy scored. Not only did Millwall take over the ground that night, we beat an Arsenal team that was full of internationals at Highbury on their own pitch. And quite frankly, the game was never in any doubt. And just to see the sight of Mark Beard outpacing Tony Adams and running towards us, and I was right behind the goal that night. I literally saw the ball, hit it, and the ball was coming towards me in the top, and it went into the top of the net, and it was a magic moment, and it has to be my most favourite game out of all. And I've been to a few. To beat Arsenal on their own pitch, with no doubt, that was really good.
Okay, and I mean, I'll be honest with you. I had a feeling you were going to say that. I thought you might have said that a game from the promotion winning season in 87, 88. But I think for me, obviously listening to you and the stories that you have, that Arsenal game tends to crop up, and I think Mark Kennedy is somebody that you tend to, whenever we talk about the sort of the best goal you've ever seen a Millwall player score.
It would have to be up there, Stephen. It would have to be up there. He collected the ball on the halfway line, and he ran them down, and they couldn't catch him. And David Seaman was in goal. I think it was David Seaman was in goal, and he just hit it, and it just went. It was behind him before he even dived, and it was just that sense of being. We had about 6,000 or 7,000 there, at least behind the goal. There was other pockets of Millwall fans. It was just a magic moment, Highbury, Arsenal, and it was just like the George Graham era as well. And Millwall did really well that night, and they really done the club proud, and it was just a great result.
I mean, you speak obviously very highly of that as a match. I'm going to push you now for a moment, favourite ever Millwall moment. Now that can be off the field, on the field, it can be during a game, it can be anything really. But what would you say is your best ever Millwall moment?
The Millwall moment, it would be off the field, but it would be the last game of the promotion winning season. We'd got promoted at Hull City the week before, and we were home to Blackburn Rovers, and we were collecting the trophy. And I was with my dad, who unfortunately passed away late last year, and we were together. And there were many older people at the ground that day that had, one, never seen Millwall play in the First Division, and two, had never really seen them win a trophy. So it was a bit of a double whammy there. And there were grown men crying when Les Briley went and picked up the trophy. And it would have to be to see something that Millwall had been going since 1885, and this was in 1980, 87. And it's a long time to go without winning a trophy or getting into the top flight. And to be part of that history, I think it would have to, particularly with my dad, it would have to be my best moment. By a long chalk. That would be it.
And interestingly, obviously, with comparisons to this season, we finish up at home to Blackburn Rovers.
We do
this year round. Obviously, slightly different prize potentially on offer. This time, obviously, then we'd won. Got promoted and had a trophy. This time, it would be to make it into the playoffs. So slightly different. Yeah. Do you see similarities with that season to this season? Is it the same? Is there a same feel? Is it completely different?
I've touched on earlier on in one of my answers about the managerial thing, and I think with John Docherty and Gary Rowett, I think it's that from that angle, it's very similar. They brought in some new players. Millwall brought in some new players, and we seem to have been up there all season, like Millwall were back in the day. And there are similarities, and I think Millwall got a great chance of getting in the playoffs. I think it's dependent on home form. I think we've got to win our home games, but there is a similarity between, and obviously with Blackburn being the last game, that's a very similar thing. So if the omens are there, then that Blackburn game might actually mean it didn't actually mean anything in terms of result back in the day, because Mill would already be promoted. This time round, with Blackburn being one of our rivals, it may mean that winner takes it all, maybe, and that makes it a very, very big game. So yeah, there are similarities, I would say, between back in the day and present day.
And what would you say is your funniest moment supporting Millwall? Anything, again, on the field, off the field, travelling to games, or anything like that?
I think you mentioned this one in your Who Are You, about the away trip to Walsall, and the fact that I'm not really typical of the so-called, how people perceive Millwall fans to be, I'm not one for running around mad and things like that. But I do get, when Millwall score, I do get excited. But that day at Walsall, when we scored that, which was quite a very, very good goal, Romeo scored that goal, and I ended up on the floor. Quite frankly, Stephen, as you know, I didn't know where I was, to be honest with you. 1 minute I'm standing next to you, and the next thing I've got this big bloke behind me, and he's jumping all over me back. And it was like one of those moments where you get up and dust yourself down and think, I hope nobody saw that sort of thing, because it just looked silly, didn't it? You looked around, and I don't think you had to look on the floor and see me on the floor. So that was a funny moment. I mean, there's probably been other moments, but that one springs to mind. It just, like, being with you, and and then the next thing on the floor and the lights going out. That was a funny moment.
Again, I was there. It was the under Harris Marlon Romeo's debut, and I think we were 1-0 up already. I think Gregory had scored already, and the 1-2 between Jed. Romeo ran onto it, hit it, and scored. And as my dad said there, it was funny, because he's not one to. You celebrate when Millwall score. We celebrate. You do. It's a natural instinct. Everybody does it. But
of course you do.
But as he said, as my dad said there, the fact of the matter was, he was sent flying, and he was on the floor over the chairs, and it was a funny moment, because I grew up watching you be perhaps a bit more mild-mannered and reserved at the best of times.
Well, I always try to teach you the right way to follow Millwall. But it's not always, it doesn't always work, does it?
No.
It was, and the thing was, on that day, if you remember, there weren't that really many of us around. I mean, when you get a big Millwall following, you expect a big push and a big surge, but quite frankly, that it wasn't, the end wasn't full. It wasn't a big end, and it was just because I had this big fella behind me, and he just jumped on me, and it just, like, get off, like, sort of thing, like, But that was quite funny, wasn't it?
That was obviously personal to us, but it was a funny moment. You 1 minute you were there, and the next minute you just wasn't. And then finally, before we come on to a couple of different questions rather than memories, I mean, over the years, I know for a fact that you've travelled up and down the country, initially on your own years ago, and then now with me later on in life. What would you say? I'm going to ask you for a different answer than that night at Arsenal, because you've obviously elaborated on that earlier. Yeah. Arsenal aside, what would you say is your best away day following the club?
Best away day following the club. Can that be a Wembley appearance? Does that count as an away day?
Well, I mean, it has become our second home in recent times. However, I will accept any answer away from the Den.
Well, I'll take that. I'll take that one out then. I won't mention, because I was going to mention the Auto Windscreen Shields final at Wembley, because again, I've been very fortunate to see Millwall play in the First Division. I've also and I was fortunate enough to see Millwall play their first ever, although there was a wartime appearance at Wembley, but for all intents and purposes, the first serious game at Wembley. So I was with you that day in 1999. So that was. But I think I'm going to go with something out of all those games. I'm going to go with something that you would remember, and I think you mentioned it as well in yours. Would be that game with away to Bristol Rovers when Sean Hutchinson scored in the last minute of the game, because the feelings that we had when we went, I think, was it 2-0 up or something like that, was it 2-0, and we thought we were in the top six for sure, and then results started. I think Southend started to win or something, and then Bristol Rovers came back into the game, and it ended up 3-3 with a few minutes to go, and it was, you went from high to low, and you thought, oh, we're not going to make it, and then all of a sudden, with virtually the last kick of the game from a corner, Sean Hutchinson headed the ball into the net, and really it was that goal that's put Millwall where they are today, really, because as you remarked in your who are you, a lot of the teams that we left behind, that we got to the playoffs and ultimately won them, but it's led to where we are today. So I think that game would be the answer to the question. I think, yeah, away to Bristol Rovers.
And I did a little bit of a curveball question. Obviously, you've been supporting the club for a long time, and picking a recent game for a favourite away game, I think because of the emotion, the emotion was that day it was nerves, then it was high, then it was low, then it was nerves.
We were there,
it
Stephen,
changed.
weren't
Yeah,
we?
it changed.
We were there, and then we wasn't. And when you look at some of the other teams where they've gone, just failed, it could have been Millwall, couldn't it? And, instead of that, we're on the cusp of the playoffs. So I think that game, in hindsight, meant a lot, and it was great just to score right at the end, and knowing that Bristol Rovers really couldn't respond and deny us where we needed to be. So yeah, that's the one.
And what would you say is the best ground that you visited? And also, to touch on that as well, I would say, correct me if I'm wrong, are you in the 70s in terms of how many grounds you've been to? Is it 70 grounds?
I think it's about 76, 77 now.
Yeah.
But of course, a lot of those grounds are now gone, and so the list keeps getting longer because teams go to different new grounds and things like that. But of the original 92 up until the new grounds started to be built, because I think Millwall was one of the Den, the new Den as they call it, or the Den. That was the first ground to be built after the Taylor report. So up until that point, I'd been to 76, 77 away grounds.
And what would you say is the best one to visit? Which one
in terms of atmosphere, or in terms of the way it looks?
Just in terms, you turn up at the game and you enjoyed the stadium. Obviously, it's not home, but you turn up and you think, oh, it was a nice place to visit. I think I know your answer, perhaps, if I say atmosphere, but what ground sticks in your mind the most?
In terms of atmosphere, or just the way it looks? Both.
Do both.
For atmosphere, it's definitely the away game against Sheffield United when I was with you.
Yeah.
It just felt, everybody knows Millwall make themselves heard wherever they go. And we did on this day, but it just seemed to me there was 30,000 people at Sheffield United that day. And we were both near to the top, weren't at the top, but we were both near to the top of the league, challenging for top six. And it just seemed to me, we had about 1,600, maybe a little bit more, I don't know. And it just seemed to me that we were surrounded, and the noise levels inside Bramall Lane that day. And I think it was because the roofs keep the noise in, that it's all roofed all the way around. And it just made, when they scored or when they attacked or when they nearly scored, it was very, very similar to the Den at its best. And so for atmosphere, I think Bramall Lane, for historical reasons and for the way it looks, I think Villa Park is by far, it's like a theatre, Villa Park. I think I can feel history at Villa Park. Well, I've been to Villa Park on half a dozen occasions with Millwall over the years. And Villa Park has never lost that sense of history and theatre to me. So Bramall Lane for atmosphere and Villa Park for aesthetics, really, the way it looks and what it means. Because Villa Park used to hold semi-final, FA Cup semi-finals and things, and you can think about what's gone on there, and it's got a very fine history. And I think those two would be the answer to the question, I think.
And now bringing it sort of forward a little bit to the current day, a couple of questions about the current squad. In your opinion, who do you think is our best player and who is your favourite player?
Well, you and I saw this player make his debut at Wigan a few years ago when it was, I think it was Steve Morrison and Gregory's last games for Millwall, and this young fella made his debut, and I always hark back to it, and I think on that day he looked as though he wanted to go forward all the time, and he looked as though he wanted to get involved, and it's Billy Mitchell, and I think Billy Mitchell's going to turn out to be one of our better players, whether that's with Millwall or more than likely if he carries on being playing the way that he is and developing the way he is, it might be with someone else. But I think Billy Mitchell on his day gives you a lot of energy, he gives you a lot of skill, and I think Billy Mitchell of the current crop would be my favourite player at the moment.
And who's the best player in the squad?
The best player in the squad, technically, and I think this is going to be no surprise. Can I answer that in two ways? Technically, I would say Zian Fleming has got more technical ability than most, but I think Sean Hutchinson is, when he plays, I know he's not been playing a lot lately because Cresswell's been in there, but I think Sean Hutchinson is a born leader, and I think he gets what Millwall's all about, and I think he would be high on the list as well. He's a leader on the pitch. He puts his body on the line. He saved many a goal for Millwall, and I think he would be close to the top as well.
And keeping it with the current squad, I usually end with this, but I'm going to do it now. And for the benefit of those that don't know my dad, I mean, some of our listeners may do. You may have seen him at games over the years. You're very pessimistic where Millwall are concerned. You don't get ahead of yourself. You try not to get caught up in it. I mean, I don't know where.
Well, when you've been supporting Millwall as long as I have, there's been loads of highs, but many lows, Stephen, and you just can't help it. But of course, I always want Millwall to win. I always want Millwall. Millwall's in my blood, but I agree. I am a little bit pessimistic, yes.
And you often give me a look when I sort of say, yeah, we're going to make the top six, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and you sort of look at me as if
well, you're different from me. You're an optimist. You see Millwall's going to win every game as far as you're concerned, but me, I'll take a different view on it because I've seen it all before.
So I'm going to put you on the spot now. We've got, as of recording, obviously, at this point, we've just come off the back of a 0-0 home draw against Luton. We're going into the Hull City away fixture. 6 games to go for us. I know a couple of teams around us have 7. Are we making the top 6? Yes or no?
I'd say yes, but that's dependent on winning at least 3 of these last 6 games, and perhaps a draw or 2. I think we can afford to lose 1. But I think that's all we can afford to lose. So I say yes, and that's dependent on winning 3 and perhaps drawing 2. And I think that might just scrape us in, particularly as a lot of the other teams, as you know, still have to play one another, and we still have to play Blackburn at the end of the season at home. So the answer to the question is yes, I do. I think it'd be tight. But dependent on winning at least 3 games.
And obviously, I think it's quite clear to most Millwall supporters, I'm going to assume yourself as well, that Luton and Middlesbrough appear to be 2 clubs that are set for the playoffs, I think now.
I'd agree with that, yes.
With Sheffield United now seemingly have a bit too much of a stronghold on second place. So that leaves 2 spots up for grabs. Obviously, you've said that you think Millwall will make it. Who do you think will be the final contender for the last playoff for the last playoff spot?
Well, I think at the moment, if you look at Blackburn's remaining fixtures, I think they've got to play at least 3 or maybe 4. I don't know. I know it's 3 of the top contenders. I have a suspicion that they rely a lot on Brereton Diaz and a few other players in their team, and they're not really firing at the moment. And I believe that they're going to drop out. And I think that Norwich may well sneak in. So my 4 playoff finalists would be Middlesbrough, Luton, Norwich, and Millwall.
If Norwich do make the playoffs, my life will be hell. As you know, my best friend supports Norwich, and I'd have to leave the country if they beat us. So
I get that, but I'll take you back to what the EFL supercomputer predicted about 4 months ago, and it's quite eerie, really. It predicted that Millwall would play Norwich in the playoffs, and that's not a million miles away, to be honest with you.
No, I know, but we don't want Norwich.
No, we don't. No, I know the problems that brings to you in particular. I know that. Yeah, I know.
Moving on, obviously, from the current squad, just again, a couple of things about your own opinions on things. I think a lot of the answers to these couple of questions are very, very similar.
Right.
Most disliked opponent. Now, that's not necessarily a direct rival, but it's a team that you've either... they seem to sort of have the hoodoo over us, someone you've never enjoyed playing. Who would you say is your most disliked opponent? You see them, there's the next fixture, and you think, oh, not them.
Look, I'm not going to surprise anyone by saying, and as I've said it before, I've supported Millwall for nearly 57 years, and they've always been there, and it goes back to the day of the Dockers and things like this. But it has to be, number one, has to be West Ham. And with me, it will always be West Ham. I just can't liken to them at all. I think they think that they're better than what they are, but when in effect they're just an up-down team. They're a yo-yo team. Secondly, I come more to the present day. I would say the second team on my list would be Leeds. Leeds are just a team that, again, I can't warm to. I think they think they're better than what they are. And quite frankly, I think this year they could come down this year. And third on my list is Crystal Palace, because as you know, you've been to Palace with me on a number of occasions, and we've been lining up at railway stations to come over with the home supporters, and we hear comments, and I think you remember that they always talk as though we're sort of second-class citizens at Millwall, and we shouldn't be losing to these people. And I mean, you and I heard that at the railway station on one occasion. So I just think they think they're a little bit above us, and a little bit special. They might be special, but I think special in a different way. So it would be West Ham, Leeds, and Crystal Palace in that order for me.
And we've touched on some moments, some matches. We've touched on players. I'm going to ask a few more questions now around, again, opinion-based, of course. But in terms of a story about following Millwall, we've pre-spoke about this, and I know that you were very keen to mention this story because it's very unique. It's very not many people will ever do what you did. At this moment in time. So I know there's a story that you're dying to tell, and I'm assuming this might possibly be the best story that you have about following the club. And again, I believe, to start with, this is going to be an off-the-pitch story.
It is going to be an off-the-pitch story, and you're quite right. I'll never forget this day. It was... I used to have grandparents that live on the Ilderton Road, and I always used to park my car outside their house, and then visit them, and then walk to the game. And we were playing Manchester United in the old First Division. The game in itself was really a bore. It was 0-0. Probably many people can remember it. Nothing really happened, but the story I'm going to tell actually really did happen, and it just made my day. And I was coming out of the game, and I got into the car and drove. I was on Ilderton Road going towards the junction of the Old Kent Road, and the traffic lights they went red, and I just looked into my rear mirror, and I looked, and I took a double take, and I saw someone that I knew, and it was Bobby Charlton, and he was driving the car. His wife was in the front of his car, and his daughter, who was at the time, she was a weather forecaster. People might remember her, and it was Bobby Charlton, and I'd never met Bobby Charlton, and and I thought I've got to get his autograph. So I put the car in neutral. Bearing in mind this is after the game. I think the crowd was about 17 or 18,000. It was packed, trying to get out onto the Old Kent Road. And I stopped the car on a red light. Got out the car. I grabbed my programme, and I didn't have a pen. All I had was a marker pen. And I thought, I've got to get Bobby Charlton's autograph. And to be fair, he saw me getting out the car. And as I walked towards his car, he had a white BMW, and he wound down the windows. It was electric windows. And he saw me coming. And I went up to the car and said, Mr. Charlton, I said, sorry for this. I said, but could I have your autograph, please? And he said, no problem. And I got him to sign the back of the programme, and with this marker pen. And the thing is you got heroes in your life, and Bobby Charlton was one of my heroes. And sometimes when you meet them, they don't come up to speed. They disappoint. But he actually wound down the window, saw the situation, and signed my programme. And he got, bearing in mind, all these cars are honking their horns and everything else. The lights are changing from red to green, red to green. It must have been about 5 minutes I was there, and he done it. And for that really has got to be one of my best Millwall moments. And you've actually, as you know, got that programme that I gave you, because I gave you all my programmes, and that really was a memorable moment for me.
It's something that there won't be many people out there that have a Millwall programme signed by Bobby Charlton.
No.
So
the circumstances to which I got it as well.
Yeah, of course.
In the middle of the Old Kent Road, basically,
And as you say, sometimes with football nowadays, that a lot of the players are idolised, they're heroes, that, a lot of youngsters, or even adults, want autographs or shirts. And it's nice that someone who's so iconic in the footballing world lived up to the expectation of a hero.
It was.
Couple more questions. We're sort of coming towards the end of this interview now. Firstly, if you could change anything about Millwall, whether it be past, present, or future, or a combination of the two, what would it be?
If I can answer that in a different way, I think just recently, and I think the pods of your podcast has spoken about this, I think Millwall are trying to change, and I don't really want them to change. I think they're going in a direction that's aligning them to the things we don't really want them to go where we want them to go to. And I think Millwall got to be very careful, because I think they are evolving. What with the new training ground, I get that they got to have a training ground, and I get that's a change because we've got to leave Calmont Road for the lease. But then you talk about the development, and you talk about the revamping of the stadium, and I think too much change is bad for Millwall. I know we've got to introduce revenue streams, and I know we've got to come up with different ideas, but I think Millwall have got, if I could answer this in a different way, I wouldn't change much, but I think Millwall are trying to change, and I think they should be very wary how they go about and not alienating people, because I think a topic of debate amongst Millwall supporters at the moment, as well as what they're doing on the pitch, is the fact that I'll give you one example. The crowds at the Den in the last 4 or 5 games have been quite large for us, but they've not been as enthusiastic and as noisy and as loud as that. And I think that's something that Millwall got to be careful of in terms of change. I wouldn't change anything other than to try and get new revenue streams and things. I get that, and to become more modern, but still keep the identity. And I think if I was to answer that, I think we've got to be wary of where Millwall are trying to get to at the moment.
I think it's an interesting topic, and it's something that we've spoke about quite a lot, travelling to and from games, each week. I think the problem is that we find is, and I know that you're quite keen on the numbers and things, that the attendances that are coming into the ground are good for the club. The money that's coming into
that's good, yes.
Into
from that
the club
angle, it
is good for the club, and to perhaps compete a little bit more moving forward. If those numbers are coming in on a regular basis, you might have a little bit more transfer budget. You might have a little bit more wiggle room for wages or agent fees or whatever cost there is in bringing in new players to the club. But on the flip side to that, I think, you know, we've been to the last few away games, and you know, Luton, when the fans went to Luton, they were very loud. You had QPR, they were very good.
Yes.
West Brom, they were very good. Reading, even at Reading with, you know, their soulless stadium, I thought us fans there were very, very good. And the smaller numbers, that hardcore fan base are making more of an atmosphere than what we're perhaps getting when we're getting
right,
18,000.
Yeah, you're right. I think, you know what? I mean, I know it's been said in on social media and in the press, but I think that it's right. I think there's more noise made with 12,000 people in the stadium than there is with 18,000 people in the stadium, and that's purely because the other, as welcome as it is, the other 6,000 people may have a Millwall connection, but they're not regulars, and I think that might be why I said what I said earlier on, that we've got to find our home form. It's dependent on our home form. I think that's why maybe we're not winning so many games at home in the last 4 or 5 games and things. I think we need to get that noise back, and I think that only comes with your regulars and not your day trippers, as they like to say. You know.
And just a couple of quirky questions before we sort of finish this one up. Again, I know the answer to this question, and I'm sure you got a little bit of a story about it as well. What's your favourite Millwall shirt of all time?
There's only one shirt. There's only one shirt and one shirt only, and that would be from the early 1970s, and that's the all-white kit with the Millwall badge on. It was the Red Lions, and I think it was a blue outline. Believe it or not, it was the only kit I ever owned. My dad bought it for me. Without going into too great detail, he didn't have a lot of money, but he bought that kit for me, and I wore that. And also at the time, I wore a pair of white boots as well. So when white boots were the first, I think Alan Ball had the first pair of white boots. He played for England, and I had my white kit and my white boots. And
what did you do with them?
Well, you know what I did with them, and I wore them and I loved them, and I left them on the train. I went to play football, and I left them on the train, and I never saw them again. And that's the only kit I ever had. I would have been 9, 10 at the time. That's the only kit I've ever had, and it meant a lot, and I lost it. My dad wasn't very pleased.
It's probably that's the reason why it was the only kit you got, was because he didn't want you to leave it on the train again.
Yeah, maybe, but I did, and it was a bad day.
And finally, and I'm not gonna steal your thunder with the answer to this question, but for the benefit of the viewers and listeners at home, my dad and I are, you know, we've been supporting the club together for a long time. My dad a long time before me, and my dear old mum has to put up with a lot of football talk and a lot of it takes over our lives a little bit. And
it does.
And the last question here is the best piece of Millwall memorabilia that you own. And the reason why I mentioned my mum is because, and I'll let you finish off.
Well, the season that Millwall were promoted to the First Division under John Docherty, it was the year that I married your mum, as you know. And mum's brother Joe was best man, and he managed, without me knowing, he managed to get a card signed by the entire squad, which he actually read out as best man at your mum and I's wedding. It was a nice surprise, and obviously the names on that will go down in Millwall history as the team that not only achieved promotion but played in the old First Division. So yeah, that's the story for that particular question.
But the benefit and the reason why I mentioned my mum is because, and from the stories that I was told, she wanted no mention of Millwall Football Club on her wedding day.
Right. Funny enough, you know, now you said it, you know that now you said that. Yeah, I mean, I used to work with a chap that liked football. He was a Tottenham supporter, but he was a guest at the wedding, and I said to him, "Look, can you keep an eye on the score in the service, because the service was at 4 o'clock. The service was at 4 o'clock, and obviously it was a 3 o'clock kickoff. And it was like Millwall. We were playing. We were playing Blackburn on that day, Steve. And it's a funny one, isn't it? It's Blackburn again.
Yeah, it's always Blackburn.
Blackburn always seemed to appear, and it was. I looked round and we were winning 1-0, and then unfortunately we lost 2-1 on that day. But I couldn't help it. I just had to find out how Millwall were doing that day.
But yeah, my dear old mum, not only did she have the football scores being fed to soon-to-be husband, the best man speech was dominated by
Millwall as well,
by a very special card. But it's a very unique. Again, that's something that's quite unique. That there won't be many supporters out there that have a wedding card.
Well, that's
signed.
That's my best bit of memorabilia.
Yeah,
that just has to be. I've still got it to this day, as you know. And the names on there are historical Millwall names, aren't they?
Well, absolutely. The only team to do it. Maybe we'll have to get another card signed this year.
Yeah. Maybe you'll have to get one
if they go on and do it. But that's been the end of Who Are You? Obviously, for myself, this has been quite a special thing for me to do. The reason why I'm here doing this podcast, and the reason why I spend thousands of pounds and thousands of miles traveling up and down the country for years and years, is because of my dad. I hope you've enjoyed his story, Dad. Thank you very much for talking to me on the podcast. Have you any final words to say?
Well, no, it's just thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it. It was a bit of trepidation in doing this, but it's been good, and thanks for having me.
No, you're more than welcome. As I say, my dad's the reason why I'm here doing this podcast. We both love the club, and thankfully he showed me the way back in, I think, 1994. So long may it continue. But that's been Who Are You? As always, this will go out on YouTube, and it will also go out on Spotify and all other podcast providers. If you would like to get involved and come and do the interview yourself, drop me a message. My Twitter will be on the screen, or drop the pod a message, and by all means we can sort out a recording. As I say, there's not really much left to say. Please like and subscribe. Please follow us across social media, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Bye, guys.